The face in the crowd. The cold breeze swept through the streets of Chicago, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant hum of traffic. The city was alive, as it always had been. Pedestrians bustling along sidewalks, taxis honking impatiently, the glow of streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. Barack Obama pulled his coat tighter around himself as he stepped out of a small bookstore on the corner of Michigan Avenue. It had been years since he left office, but the weight of leadership never truly left him. Retirement, if he could even call it that, was filled with speaking engagements, books to write, and causes to support. Yet, as fulfilling as his post-presidency life was, there were moments when he felt strangely detached from the world around him. The policies he once shaped, the words he once spoke with unwavering conviction, they had made an impact, surely. But had they truly reached the people who needed them most? Had the lives he set out to improve really changed? As he walked along the sidewalk, his mind was lost in thought. He had just finished a panel discussion about economic disparity, listening to experts talk about income inequality, systemic failures, and the ever-growing gap between the privileged and the forgotten. He had nodded along, spoken eloquently about solutions, but deep down, a familiar restlessness gnawed at him. It was one thing to talk about poverty and injustice from a stage. It was another to see it. That was why he walked now, endlessly, through the streets of Chicago, his home, the city that had shaped him, the place where he had started as a young community organizer. He wanted to remember what it felt like to be among the people, to see their faces, to feel their struggles. Then he saw her. She was sitting near the entrance of a small park, hunched over on a weathered bench. A battered shopping cart stood beside her, filled with layers of worn blankets, plastic bags, and scattered belongings. She was wrapped in a mismatched coat, far too thin for the approaching winter. Her hands, frail and unsteady, clutched at the folds of fabric around her shoulders, as if trying to trap whatever warmth she could. Barack had seen homeless people before, too many times. He had walked past them on streets, watched them huddled in corners of train stations, seen their presence in the background of his speeches about social reform. But this time, something was different. There was something about her posture, the way she held herself, the way her shoulders curled inward like she was trying to make herself invisible. Recognition flickered in his mind, distant but insistent. He slowed his pace. He studied her face. The graying hair, the deep-set eyes, the way her mouth pressed into a thin, firm line. He knew these things, not just as a passing face, not just as a stranger lost to the system. He knew her. A rush of memory hit him like a wave. The smell of chalk dust in a classroom. The sound of her voice, firm yet patient. The steady way she wrote on the blackboard, explaining complex ideas in a way that made sense. The way she had looked at him when he was just a boy, when he wasn't yet a senator, not yet a president, but just another young kid trying to find his way in the world. Miss Hartwell. The name left his lips before he could stop himself. The woman on the bench flinched. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes met his. A flicker of something, confusion, recognition, disbelief, passed over her face. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "I don't know you," she muttered, looking away. But Barack knew better. He took a cautious step forward, lowering his voice. "It's me, Barack Obama." This time, her body tensed. She inhaled sharply, her hands tightening around the fabric of her coat. He could see the struggle in her expression, the battle between wanting to acknowledge him and wanting to retreat back into the anonymity she had built around herself. She started, but the words faltered. Barack crouched slightly so that he was at her eye level. "Miss Hartwell," he said again, softer this time. "You were my teacher." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she spoke. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. The words stung in a way he hadn't expected. He had imagined this moment going differently. Maybe she would smile, laugh in surprise, say something about how much time had passed. Maybe she would ask about his life, tell him she had been proud to see what he had become. Instead, there was only distance, a wall of shame, built high and strong. "I didn't mean to," he started, but she shook her head. "Just go," she muttered, curling into herself. "I don't need your pity." Pity. The word settled between them like a cold stone. Barak hesitated. He had seen that look before, in veterans who had returned from war, in people who had lost everything and didn't know how to ask for help. It wasn't just about pride. It was about survival. "I don't pity you," he said finally. "I just want to understand." She laughed, a short, hollow sound. "Understand?" She scoffed. "You're Barack Obama. What is there to understand?" He looked at her then, really looked at her. The exhaustion in her eyes. The way her hands trembled from something more than just the cold. The weight of years of hardship etched into her face. "You were one of the best teachers I ever had," he said, his voice steady. "You believed in me when I was just a kid trying to figure out where I fit in the world." He exhaled slowly. "Let me return the favor." She looked away, staring at the pavement. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "It's too late." Barak shook his head. "No," he said. "It's not." She didn't respond. But she didn't tell him to leave either. That was enough. For now. He stood up, brushing off his coat. "Come with me," he said gently. "Let's get something to eat." Miss Hartwell hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. As they walked together toward a small cafe down the street, Barack Obama knew that this was just the beginning. There were questions to be answered, a past to uncover, and most importantly, a life to rebuild. One step at a time. Echoes of the past. The small cafe was warm, a welcome contrast to the biting chill of the Chicago air outside. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and buttered toast lingered in the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversation from the scattered patrons. Barack Obama held the door open as Miss Hartwell stepped hesitantly inside, her movements slow, almost reluctant, as though she feared she didn't belong in a place like this anymore. She looked smaller here, shrunken by the weight of something unseen but heavy nonetheless. He guided her to a corner booth, away from the bustle of the cafe's main seating area. As she settled into the seat, her shoulders hunched slightly, her fingers twitching against the edge of the table. She kept her eyes cast downward, avoiding the glances of strangers, her posture guarded, defensive. Barack recognized the body language immediately. It was the stance of someone who had spent too long being ignored, who had learned to take up as little space as possible, to shrink into the background until they were invisible. A waitress arrived, her smile polite but cautious as she pulled out a notepad. "What can I get for you?" Barack glanced at Miss Hartwell, waiting for her to answer. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the frayed sleeves of her coat. "I just coffee," she mumbled. He frowned but didn't push. "And a bowl of soup," he added, turning back to the waitress. "Something warm." Miss Hartwell stiffened at the addition, but said nothing. The waitress nodded and scribbled down the order before disappearing toward the kitchen. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Barack leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "I wasn't expecting to see you again," he said after a moment, keeping his voice light but steady. "It's been a long time." Miss Hartwell let out a short, humorless laugh. "A lifetime," she muttered under her breath. She ran a hand through her graying hair, exhaling sharply. "And now you see me like this." She lifted a hand vaguely, gesturing toward herself. The worn clothes, the weary face, the hands that trembled just slightly from the cold, or maybe from something deeper. Barack studied her, his gaze searching. "You were my teacher," he said. "You were one of the first people who made me believe I could be something more. That I mattered." She scoffed. "And look at you now. And look at me." Her voice was flat, but beneath it was something raw, something fragile. The waitress returned, setting down a steaming bowl of soup and a cup of coffee in front of her. Miss Hartwell hesitated before wrapping her hands around the coffee cup, as though soaking in its warmth. She didn't touch the soup. Barak took a slow breath. "What happened, Miss Hartwell?" he asked, his voice quieter now. For a long moment, she didn't answer. She stirred her coffee absently, staring into the dark liquid as if searching for something within it. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, measured, distant, as if she were recounting a story that didn't belong to her anymore. "I used to love teaching," she said, her fingers tightening slightly around the spoon. "It was everything to me. I started fresh out of college, full of ideas, full of hope. I thought if I could just reach my students, if I could make them believe in themselves, then maybe I was doing something right. Maybe I was making a difference." She paused, her lips pressing together, as if the words were caught in her throat. Barak waited, knowing she needed time to untangle the knots of her past before she could let them spill out. "For 30 years, I taught at the same school," she continued. 30 years. I watched kids come and go, saw them grow into something more, saw them find their paths. Some went on to do great things. Others, she exhaled, shaking her head. Others got lost along the way. Barak could hear the unspoken grief in her voice, the pain of having watched some of her students slip through the cracks despite everything she had done to lift them up. She finally picked up the spoon and took a small, tentative sip of the soup, as if she wasn't sure she deserved it. When she set the spoon down again, her eyes had darkened with something deeper. "Then things change," she said. "Slowly, at first. Small shifts in policy, little adjustments to the curriculum. Things that didn't seem like much on their own. But together, they built into something I couldn't ignore. I started getting letters from administration about my teaching style. I was told I wasn't adapting to modern educational methods." She let out another laugh, but it was bitter this time. It wasn't about my methods. It was about my age. About the fact that I had been there too long, that I didn't fit the image they wanted for their school anymore. She shook her head, her expression tight. "I fought it. I appealed. I told them my experience mattered, that my students were still learning, that I still had something to offer. But they didn't care." Her hands clenched on the table. "They pushed me out." The words hung between them like a weight, pressing into the space where hope used to live. Barak felt something twist in his chest. He had heard this story before, in different forms, from different people. Good people, people who had dedicated their lives to something only to be discarded when they no longer fit the system's mold. But hearing it now from Miss Hartwell, from a woman who had once stood in front of his classroom with so much authority, so much presence, it was different. It was personal. She let out a slow, measured breath. "I thought I'd find another job," she murmured. "I thought surely, after 3 decades of experience, someone would want me. But every interview ended the same way. 'We'll keep your application on file.'" She scoffed, shaking her head. "They weren't looking for someone like me. They wanted someone younger, someone they could pay less, someone who fit the new mold." She reached for the coffee again, taking a slow sip, as if trying to swallow down the bitterness in her voice. "My savings ran out," she said finally. "My rent went up. I lost my apartment. I tried staying in shelters, but they aren't safe, especially for women." Her fingers trembled slightly as she set the cup down. "So I started sleeping outside." She said it so simply, as if she had made peace with it long ago, but Barak could hear what she wasn't saying. The fear, the shame, the exhaustion that had settled into her bones. A deep silence stretched between them. Miss Hartwell let out a slow, shaky breath. "You wanted to know what happened to me, Barak." She looked up at him now, her gaze steady, unflinching. "This is what happened. I was discarded, forgotten. And now, I am no one." Barak met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "No," he said quietly. "You are not no one." She scoffed, shaking her head. "You don't understand. You can't fix this. You can't change what's already been done." He leaned forward slightly, his voice firm but gentle. "Maybe I can't change the past, but I can change what happens next. Miss Hartwell stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she looked away. She didn't believe him. Not yet. But Barack Obama had never been one to walk away from a fight. And he wasn't going to start now. The weight of the years. The rain had started as they left the cafe, a soft drizzle that barely clung to the air before turning into a steady downpour. Barack Obama walked beside Miss Hartwell, their steps slow and measured as they moved down the sidewalk. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, painting the city in a soft, golden glow. She walked with her hands buried deep into the folds of her coat, her body hunched slightly forward, as if bracing herself against more than just the cold. Barack glanced at her from the corner of his eye, watching the way her breath curled into the night air in small, exhausted puffs. She looked as if she had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for far too long. He had seen that look before, on soldiers returning from war, on single mothers working 3 jobs, on the faces of those who had fought their entire lives just to survive. It was the look of someone who had been through the fire and come out the other side, not unscathed, not unbroken, but still standing. As they reached the car waiting for them at the curb, Miss Hartwell hesitated. She glanced at Barack, her eyes shadowed with uncertainty. "I can take care of myself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been doing it for years." Barack met her gaze, his expression steady. No one is supposed to do it alone. She didn't argue, but she also didn't move right away. It was as if she was standing on the edge of something, staring into an abyss she wasn't sure she wanted to cross. He took a step closer. "Miss Hartwell, I'm not offering charity. I'm not here to make you feel small or take away your independence. But I am here, and I am not going to walk away from you." Her breath hitched slightly, just a small, almost imperceptible movement in her chest. And then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. They climbed into the car, the interior warm and quiet, insulated from the storm raging outside. The driver pulled into traffic, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence between them. Miss Hartwell sat rigid in her seat, her fingers curled into her lap, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. Barack knew that silence well. It was the silence of someone trying to hold themselves together, trying to keep the cracks from spreading too far. He let it sit for a moment before he spoke. "Where is your family?" She stiffened slightly, and for a moment, he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she let out a slow, controlled breath. "I had 2 sons," she said, her voice measured. "David and Aaron. They were good boys. Smart, stubborn, just like their father." A small, almost wistful smile flickered across her lips, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Their father passed away when they were young. It was just me and them for a long time." Barack listened, waiting. "They grew up fast," she continued. "Too fast. I worked late hours at the school, tried to give them everything they needed. But boys need more than a roof over their heads and food on the table. They need time. And I didn't have enough of it to give them." She exhaled, her fingers tightening around the hem of her coat. "When things started falling apart, when I lost my job, my home, I didn't want them to see me like this. I didn't want them to think I was a burden." She let out a bitter laugh. "So I disappeared before they could walk away first." Barack felt something cold settle in his chest. "Miss Hartwell," he said carefully, "do you really think they would have walked away?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she turned to look at him, her gaze raw and unguarded. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I couldn't take the risk." The weight of her words hung between them. Barack thought about his own mother, about the sacrifices she had made, about the times she had struggled in silence because she didn't want to burden him. He thought about all the people he had met in his life who had been conditioned to believe that their pain was theirs alone to bear. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He hesitated for only a second before handing it to her. She frowned, unfolding it carefully. As her eyes scanned the page, her breath caught. "What is this?" she whispered. "It's their numbers," Barack said gently. "Their addresses." I found them. She didn't move, didn't breathe. I called them, he continued. They've been looking for you, Miss Hartwell. Her hands trembled slightly, the paper shaking between her fingers. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to push back a tide of emotion she wasn't ready for. No, she said, shaking her head. No, that can't be true. It is, Barak said. They thought you were gone. They thought they had lost you. But they never stopped wondering. They never stopped hoping. Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly looked away, blinking furiously. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered. What if they don't want me anymore? What if I ruined everything? Barak reached across the seat, resting a hand on her shoulder. The only way you'll ever know is if you try. She swallowed hard, staring at the numbers on the paper as if they held the weight of the world. The car slowed as they pulled up to a quiet hotel. The driver stepped out, opening the door, but Miss Hartwell didn't move. She was frozen in place, the storm of emotions raging inside her more powerful than the one outside. Barak sat beside her, patient. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she folded the paper carefully, tucking it into her coat pocket. She didn't look at him when she spoke. Tomorrow, she said, her voice hoarse. Tomorrow, I'll decide. Barak nodded, knowing that was the most he could ask for. As she stepped out of the car and into the hotel lobby, he watched her go, knowing that tomorrow would be the first step in a journey neither of them could predict. But for the first time in years, Miss Hartwell had something she had long since thought she lost. A choice. The road to redemption. The morning was quiet. The kind of quiet that felt heavy, filled with unsaid words and emotions kept at bay. The city outside was already alive. Horns honking, buses hissing to a stop, pedestrians rushing to wherever they needed to be. But inside the small hotel room, time seemed to stand still. Miss Hartwell sat by the window, staring out at the gray sky beyond the glass. Her hands were folded in her lap, her fingers lightly brushing over the small piece of paper tucked into the folds of her coat. The numbers, the addresses, her son's. She had spent the entire night staring at that paper, running her fingers over the ink as if she could somehow erase the past and rewrite it. But no matter how many times she looked at it, no matter how many scenarios played through her mind, the reality remained the same. She was standing at a crossroads. For years, she had told herself that disappearing had been the right choice, that by walking away, she had spared her sons from the burden of watching her fall apart. It was easier to believe that they had moved on, that they had built lives without the weight of her failures hanging over them. But now, Barak had taken that fragile illusion and shattered it. They had been looking for her. They had never stopped wondering. And now, they knew she was alive. A sharp knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She hesitated before standing, smoothing down the worn fabric of her coat as if it would somehow make her feel more put together. With a deep breath, she opened the door. Barack Obama stood there, a paper cup of coffee in one hand, a small bag in the other. "Morning," he said simply, stepping inside. He placed the coffee and bag on the small table by the window before turning to face her. "How are you feeling?" Miss Hartwell exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. "Like someone dug up ghosts I wasn't ready to face." Barak nodded as if he understood. And in many ways, he did. He had met many people who carried the weight of their past like a chain around their neck, who convinced themselves they were beyond saving. He had spent his life fighting against that belief, but he also knew that no amount of speeches or good intentions could make someone choose to fight for themselves. They had to want it. "Did you think about what I said?" he asked, his voice careful. Miss Hartwell sat down, staring at the untouched coffee. "All night," she admitted. "But I don't know if I can do it." Barak pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his hands clasped together. "What's stopping you?" She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "What isn't?" She gestured vaguely at herself. "Look at me, Barak. I'm not the woman they remember. I'm not the mother they need. I'm—" her voice faltered, and she looked away. "I'm nothing. Barak's expression remained calm, steady. "You're not nothing," he said firmly. "You're their mother. That hasn't changed." She shook her head. "You don't know what it's like. To be out there. To have people look at you like you don't exist. Or worse, to have them pretend you're invisible so they don't have to feel guilty." Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her coat. "After a while, you start to believe it. You start to disappear, even from yourself." Barak leaned forward slightly. "But you're not invisible anymore, and they don't want you to be." She swallowed hard. The emotions she had spent years burying were clawing their way to the surface, threatening to break through. She had spent so long pretending she didn't need anyone, that she could survive alone. But survival was different from living. "They'll hate me," she whispered. "They won't," Barak said, his voice steady. "They might be hurt. They might be angry. But they won't hate you." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Miss Hartwell let out a slow breath. "I don't know how to start." Barak smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his phone. "Then let's start small," he said, scrolling through his contacts before placing the phone on the table between them. The screen displayed a name, David Hartwell. Her son. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stared at it, her breath uneven. The weight of the past pressed down on her, but so did the fragile hope of the future. "You don't have to say everything today," Barak said gently. "Just talk to him. Let him hear your voice." Miss Hartwell hesitated. Then, slowly, as if reaching for something she wasn't sure was real, she picked up the phone. Barak watched as she pressed the call button, lifting it to her ear. The line rang once, twice. Then, a voice. "Hello." Miss Hartwell's breath hitched. She opened her mouth, but for a moment, no words came out. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she said, "David." A sharp inhale came from the other end of the line. There was a long pause, then a choked response. "Mom." Miss Hartwell's eyes filled with tears. Her grip on the phone tightened as her shoulders shook, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel. She allowed herself to hope. Barak sat silently, giving her the space she needed as she spoke to the son she had thought was lost to her. This was just the beginning. But it was a beginning nonetheless. And for Miss Hartwell, that was more than she had ever dared to hope for. Bridges to the past. The phone call had been the hardest thing Miss Hartwell had done in years. It had lasted only a few minutes, but within those minutes, time had stretched in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. David's voice had been hesitant at first, almost disbelieving. When he had said her name, Mom, it had sent a shock through her body, a reminder that she had once been more than just a ghost wandering through the world. She had been someone's mother. She had been loved. But with that love came pain. His words, though laced with longing, had also carried the weight of questions she wasn't sure she could answer. "Where have you been? Why didn't you tell us? Do you know how long we looked for you? And the worst one of all, why did you leave us?" She had tried to explain, her voice breaking under the pressure of years of silence. She had told him about losing her job, about struggling to find another, about how the world had quietly erased her until there was nothing left but survival. She had told him that she had wanted to spare them the burden of watching her fall. David had listened. He hadn't interrupted. But when the call ended, she had felt the unmistakable sting of uncertainty. She didn't know if she had given him the answers he needed. Now, as she sat in the back of Barak's car, watching the city pass by through the rain-streaked window, she felt like she was walking a tightrope between past and future. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, as if she were holding herself together. "They want to see me," she said finally, breaking the silence. Barak, who had been reading something on his phone, looked up. He studied her face, sensing the conflict there. "That's good," he said carefully. "Do you want to see them?" Miss Hartwell exhaled sharply. "I don't know." She shook her head. "What if they only agreed because of you? Because you asked them to?" Barak leaned back against the seat. "I didn't ask them to do anything," he said. "I told them you were alive. The rest was their choice. Miss Hartwell nodded absently, but the doubt lingered. "It's been years," she murmured. "They have families now. Lives. What if I don't fit into them anymore?" Barak gave her a small, knowing smile. "Miss Hartwell, I think you're underestimating how much a son can love his mother. They haven't forgotten you. And they sure as hell aren't going to let you disappear again." She wanted to believe that. She really did. The car slowed to a stop. Barak glanced out the window, then back at her. "We're here." Miss Hartwell's stomach twisted. She turned her head slowly, eyes falling on the house before them. It was modest but warm-looking, the kind of home where life happened, where children ran through the yard, where family dinners were filled with laughter and conversation. She could see the porch light glowing softly, casting a golden hue against the damp pavement. The door opened before she had even stepped out of the car. David stood there, looking older than she remembered, broader, with lines etched into his face that hadn't been there before. And yet, in the way he looked at her, cautious, uncertain, but hopeful, she saw the boy he had once been, the boy she had raised. Her breath caught. She wasn't ready. But the past had come to claim her, whether she was ready or not. Barak opened his door, stepping out first. Miss Hartwell followed, her legs feeling heavier than they ever had before. The steps to the porch felt impossibly long. She wanted to turn back. She wanted to run. Then David stepped forward. "Mom." It wasn't a question this time. It wasn't disbelief. It was real. Miss Hartwell's lips trembled. "David." He swallowed hard, his hands clenching at his sides. "You really?" He stopped, shaking his head as if he couldn't find the words. Then, before she could prepare herself, he stepped forward and pulled her into a hug. She stiffened at first, her body unsure how to respond to something so warm, so full of emotion. But then something inside her cracked, and she clung to him, her fingers gripping the back of his shirt like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. She felt his chest rise and fall against hers, heard the shaky exhale as he whispered, "I thought I'd lost you forever." Tears burned her eyes, slipping silently down her weathered cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry." David didn't let go. "We looked for you," he said, his voice thick. "Aaron and I. We never stopped wondering. We thought maybe." He shook his head against her shoulder. "I don't care what happened. I just want you back." Miss Hartwell squeezed her eyes shut, the weight of those words sinking deep into her bones. A second voice broke through the moment. "Mom." She turned her head, her breath catching again. Aaron stood in the doorway, his expression torn between disbelief and relief. He looked so much like his father, she thought absently, the resemblance striking in a way she hadn't noticed before. He had always been the quieter one, the more reserved of her boys. Now he was staring at her like she was a ghost. She pulled away from David, taking the shaky step forward. "Aaron." For a second, he just stood there. Then, in an instant, he was moving, crossing the distance between them in 3 quick steps before wrapping his arms around her. She broke. Years of silence, of loneliness, of believing she had been forgotten. They all crumbled as she stood there, held between her sons, the 2 people she had convinced herself she would never see again. Barak stood to the side, watching the moment unfold, a small, satisfied smile on his face. He knew that this reunion wouldn't fix everything. There were still wounds to heal, still things left unsaid. But for now, it was enough. After a long moment, David stepped back, clearing his throat. "Come inside," he said, his voice rough. "We have a lot to talk about." Miss Hartwell hesitated. The thought of stepping into their world after all these years terrified her. But then Aaron reached for her hand, squeezing it lightly, grounding her in the moment. And so, for the first time in years, she walked through a door she never thought she would see again. The past had come full circle. And for the first time in a long, long time, Miss Hartwell allowed herself to hope for the future. A future worth fighting for. The warmth of the house was almost overwhelming. The moment Miss Hartwell stepped inside, she was enveloped in the scent of something familiar. Home. There was a faint trace of cinnamon in the air, mixed with coffee and the distant, lingering aroma of a meal that had been cooked hours ago. It was the kind of smell that made a place feel lived in, the kind of scent that reminded her of the days when her life had been filled with small, everyday moments of comfort. She stood in the doorway, unsure of where to go, unsure if she even belonged. David and Aaron moved instinctively, clearing space as if afraid she might bolt. She could feel their hesitation, their uncertainty. They wanted to bridge the gap, to make up for lost time, but neither of them knew how. Barak stepped inside behind her, but he lingered near the door, sensing that this was a moment meant for family. David gestured toward the living room. "Come sit, Mom." His voice was gentle, but it carried an edge of nervousness. Miss Hartwell hesitated for only a moment before following him. The living room was modest but warm, filled with bookshelves, framed family photos, and small signs of a life well lived. She saw pictures of her sons with their wives, pictures of smiling children, her grandchildren. She realized with a quiet jolt. She had missed so much. She sat down slowly on the couch, her hands folding in her lap. She suddenly felt too small for the space, as if she were intruding on a life that had moved on without her. Aaron sat across from her in an armchair, his gaze never leaving her face. David settled into the chair beside him, his fingers tapping absently against the armrest, a nervous habit he had picked up as a child. The silence stretched, heavy and uncertain. David finally broke it. "Where have you been all these years?" His voice wasn't accusatory, but it carried the weight of years of unanswered questions. Miss Hartwell inhaled deeply, gathering the courage to speak. She had spent so long running from this conversation, so long pretending she had made the right choice by disappearing. But now, sitting here, in the home of the children she had left behind, she realized she owed them more than silence. "I was ashamed," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I lost everything. My job, my home. And I thought if I told you, if you saw me like that, it would hurt you more than if I just disappeared." Aaron's brow furrowed. "You thought it would hurt less if we thought you were dead." His voice wasn't angry, but there was something raw in it. She flinched. "I didn't think I had a choice. I was living on the streets. I didn't want you to see me like that. I didn't want you to feel like you had to take care of me." David ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. "Mom, we're your sons. Taking care of you wouldn't have been a burden." She looked at him, pain flickering in her eyes. "I didn't know how to ask for help." The weight of that admission hung between them. For a long time, none of them spoke. Then Aaron shifted, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You should have come to us," he said, his voice quieter now. "We would have done anything to help you." Miss Hartwell swallowed hard. "I know that now. But at the time, I felt like I had already failed you both." She gestured around the room. "You built lives without me. Families. I didn't think I had a place in them anymore." David's jaw tightened. "That wasn't your decision to make." That stung, but she knew he was right. Barak cleared his throat from near the doorway. "Families are complicated," he said, stepping forward slightly. "But the thing about love is, it doesn't disappear just because time has passed." He looked at David and Aaron. "And the fact that you're both here, right now, tells me that your mother isn't as lost to you as she thinks." David exhaled through his nose, glancing at his brother before looking back at their mother. "I'm not going to lie, Mom. It's been hard. We grieved you. And now you're here, and we don't know how to process it." Aaron nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's like we just got you back, but we don't know if you're staying." Miss Hartwell's breath hitched. She had spent so long believing she was the one who had been abandoned, but in reality, she had been the one to leave. And now, her sons weren't just afraid of losing her again. They were afraid of hoping for something that might not last. She took a deep, steadying breath. "I don't know how to make this right overnight," she admitted. "I don't even know where to start." David's expression softened slightly. "Then let's start small." Aaron nodded. "Stay for dinner," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Miss Hartwell's eyes widened slightly. "Dinner?" David shrugged. "Yeah, it's nothing fancy, but—" He hesitated before finishing. "It's been a long time since we all sat at a table together." Her throat tightened. She had spent years convinced she had no place in their world. But here they were, offering her a seat at their table. She nodded, her voice barely holding steady. "I'd like that." A small, almost relieved smile flickered across Aaron's face before he stood. "I'll go set the table." David followed him into the kitchen, leaving Miss Hartwell alone in the living room with Barak. She turned to him, her eyes filled with something fragile yet hopeful. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me," she admitted. Barak smiled, his gaze warm. "I think you would have found your way eventually." She let out a soft, almost shy laugh. "I don't know about that." He studied her for a moment before speaking. "You know, Miss Hartwell, there are a lot of kids out there who need teachers like you, kids who don't have someone to tell them they matter." She frowned slightly. "Barak." He raised a hand, cutting her off gently. "I'm not saying you have to go back into a full-time classroom, but what if there was a place for you? A way for you to do what you love again, even in a small way." She hesitated, the idea both terrifying and tempting. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. Barak chuckled. "You just took the first step." She glanced toward the kitchen, where she could hear her sons talking, the faint sound of dishes clinking. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about survival. She was thinking about something more. A future, a place where she belonged. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to fight for it. A new chapter. A week had passed since Miss Hartwell had stepped back into her sons' lives. In that time, she had relearned what it meant to wake up in a warm bed, to sit at a kitchen table with family, to exist in a space where she was not just a shadow passing through. It was not easy. There were long conversations, some filled with laughter, others with painful truths. David and Aaron were still processing everything, and so was she. They had grieved her for years, and now she had returned, not as the strong, independent woman they had known, but as someone who had been broken by the world and was still learning how to put herself back together. But they did not turn her away. They did not make her feel like a burden. And that, more than anything, was what allowed her to begin healing. Barak had stayed in touch. He had visited twice, always careful not to overwhelm her with too many suggestions about what came next. He knew this was her journey to take at her own pace, but he also knew that she was not meant to simply fade into the background again. Which was why, today, she stood in front of the Washington Community Education Center, staring up at the modest brick building that held more promise than she had felt in years. The invitation had been simple. Come see the place, meet some of the children, just sit in and observe. She wasn't committing to anything, not yet, but even walking through the doors felt like a step toward something she had thought was lost to her forever. Barak met her at the entrance, smiling as he held the door open. "You ready?" Miss Hartwell exhaled, gripping the strap of the old purse she had been given. "Not really." He chuckled. "Good. That means it's worth doing." She gave him a look but followed him inside. The building was full of life. Laughter echoed down the hallways. The walls were lined with artwork and motivational posters, and in every room, there were children who needed someone to believe in them. Miss Hartwell stood near the doorway of one classroom, watching as a young boy struggled through a reading assignment, frustration evident on his face. His teacher, patient but clearly exhausted, knelt beside him, gently guiding his finger along the page. Miss Hartwell knew that struggle. She had seen it in the eyes of so many children over the years, and before she even realized what she was doing, she stepped forward. She knelt beside the boy, her voice gentle but firm. "It's not about getting it perfect," she said, picking up the book. "It's about trying. Let's take it one word at a time." The boy looked at her warily, but nodded. Barak, standing by the door, smiled. She was a teacher. She always had been. And today, for the first time in years, she had found her way back.